Good afternoon from Jakarta. Welcome to our virtual public discussion on the way forward, a North-South dialogue for peace in Palestine. This event is brought to you by FPCI Middle Power Studies Network in collaboration with Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. FPCI Middle Power Studies Network, or short for FPCI MPSN, is a unit in FPCI that was established to create an international network consisting of experts, think tanks, and practitioners from middle power countries in order to develop greater knowledge on the role of middle powers in international relations and the specific strategies employed by them navigating the dynamic of international order. My name is Harza, and I will be your master of ceremony for today's event. First of all, we would like to welcome our distinguished speakers and moderator for today, Mr. Dan Smith, Director of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, Mrs. Margaret Reynolds, President of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and former Senator of Queensland, Australia, and Ms. Irene Gayatri, Senior Researcher at the National Research and Innovation Agency, BRIN. Also, welcome to all of the participants who are joining with us today from our YouTube channel. We have over 200 registrants coming from more than 30 countries, including Sweden, Australia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, United States, India, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Canada, and many others. Ladies and gentlemen, to open today's session, I would like to welcome our founder and chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Dr. Dino Patijalal, to give his opening remarks. Mr. Dino, you may take the floor.
Thank you very much. First, I want to say hello to Margaret Reynolds, who is all the way down under, Dan Smith, all the way up in the north from Sweden. And by the way, this event is born out of our meeting that I had with him in Stockholm some time ago. So thank you, Dan, for your collaboration. Thank you also, Irene Gayatri, the senior researcher at Indonesia's National Research Agency, BRIN, and then Radityo Dharmaputra, who is FPCI fellow who heads our Middle Power Studies Network. And this is a very timely discussion about peace in Palestine, and we all very much we see what's going on in the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, and how much suffering it has produced on both sides. The latest count is over 10,000 casualties on both sides. 1 million people displaced from Gaza area, and so on and so on. And we don't know how this present conflict will play out, and for how long before things return to normalcy. But it is a valid question to ask, what is the prospect for peace in Palestine? There are, of course, many solutions that you can consider. The first one is a military solution, but we know this is something that will never produce peace on both sides. Israel military solution will never deliver peace in Palestine, and similarly, any amount of attacks and missiles or bombs from Hamas will never produce a peaceful outcome in terms of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Right? So a political solution is the only way by which we can achieve peace. And I think there are two possibilities. The first one is the preservation of the existing status quo. And I think many Palestinians would agree that this is not a tenable proposition, preserving a system that most Palestinians think is unjust, and also does not deliver them the right of living in a free, independent Palestine that they aspire to. And the second one would be a two-state solution, and this solution has been agreed in principle by both sides and has won the recognition and support from much of the international community in the in the Middle East and also in the Western countries, supported by many countries in the global South, including Indonesia. But I think this solution, this medicine, is losing ground. Public opinion, if the surveys are right, both in Israel and Palestine are becoming less supportive of this solution. There's no negotiations in recent years to reach a two-state solution, and the international actors that used to be in the front line of mediating this does not seem to be there, and especially the recent Israel-Hamas war in Gaza seem to be keeping the two-state solution farther and farther away, right? We're here to discuss this. What is the way forward? To what extent is the two-state solution still alive and still has prospects to deliver peace in Palestine? And how would that be achieved? Right? And is there other solutions? I'm hearing that there are some ideas being thrown around, and there would like to hear what these ideas are, and we can discuss them in this discussion. Having said that, again, I want to thank Dan Smith for joining this discussion, Margaret Reynolds and Irene Gayatri. This is going to be a fascinating North-South discussion on this important issue. And the reason it is important is because it seems to be an issue that has divided the North and the South. There's strong policy response and public opinions that are different between the global North and the global South. It's timely for us to this discussion, and I wish you a very good examination of this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dino, for your message. Now, I would like to welcome our moderator, Mr. Radityo Dharmaputra, to lead today's discussion. Mr. Radityo is the program coordinator of FPCI Middle Power Studies Network. Mr. Radityo, you may have the floor.
So thank you so much, Herza, for starting the discussion, and thank you, Pak Dino, for such a, I think, very important opening speech. You mentioned several things, especially regarding two-state solutions, which I believe we will discuss. You also mentioned the need for a North-South dialogue, and I think this is a very good panel. I'm very excited to not lead the discussion, but just to moderate all the distinguished speaker here. We have Dan Smith, director of CIPRI. We have Margaret Reynolds, the national president for Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Australia. And we also have Mbak Irene from the National Research Agency of Indonesia. So just to add to the beginning of our discussion, we all probably see the debates, the discussion, and the votes in the United Nations General Assembly, where it shows how different this many in the North, in many countries in the North, either vote against the resolution, the resolution on the humanitarian truce, or either abstain from voting, whereas the many countries in the global South voted for the resolution, which, especially coming after almost 2 years of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it created a lot of tension between the North and the South. I believe just several days ago, Irene wrote an interesting article in the Jakarta Post regarding this challenge or tension about liberal international order, how the North and the South differ in seeing this issue of order, of humanitarian aspect. And I think this is a very important North-South dialogues between academics, between scholars, between also different countries to discuss the potential solution. We all also see the tragedy, the humanitarian tragedy in Gaza. So I believe all three of our distinguished speakers will have very good insight about that. And I will start giving the speakers 5 minutes, just short remarks before we then delve deeper into the issues. So I will start with Mr. Dan Smith from CIPRI to give his opening remarks. Dan, please.
So thank you very much, Raditya, and thank you to FCPI for the collaboration and invitation to join with this. And, it's a very good meeting and discussion that I had with Dino back in some months ago in Stockholm that has helped lay the foundation for this. And I'm very pleased to see the conversation happening. As I think you've both said already, this is both a timely conversation and a complex conversation. And I think there's a number of things that to take into account kind of at the beginning as the foundations for the conversation as we start to think our way towards a solution to what has proven to be, for a variety of reasons, an extremely intractable conflict over the past, really, if one goes back, it's over more than a century now, but obviously especially since the foundation of the State of Israel. I think one thing to say is that over the question of the humanitarian pause, I think that you will find that there is a difference in many countries between public opinion and government policy. That public opinion more easily accepts the case for a humanitarian pause and sees a clear distinction between a pause and a ceasefire. One can understand the arguments against a ceasefire as such. They're the same as the arguments in Ukraine. Why will Ukraine not accept a ceasefire? It's because it will allow Russia to build up its forces and positions again. So one can see those arguments, but I think that many people find it very hard to understand why there is any kind of an argument against a humanitarian pause. And this, I think, then, and I mentioned Ukraine deliberately, this introduces the vulnerability to the criticism of double standards. And that, I think, is always quite clear in this kind of discussion. And when in February last year, the UN Security Council discussed the question of Russia's, if you remember, recognition of the breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine, it was the Kenyan permanent representative who made an extremely important intervention, in my view, to say this is wrong, what Russia is wanting to do, but please, will you listen to your own double standards? Please, will you acknowledge how badly Western powers, including members of the UN Security Council at the time, have treated international law, so that when you are calling now for respect for international law, remember that you didn't respect it before, and show some humility and show some consciousness about that, and start trying to reform your behavior, for heaven's sakes. And I think the same thing arises when you look at the question of the humanitarian pause. You weep the tears over Ukraine, and you weep the tears over the horrible atrocities that Hamas committed in southern Israel. Why are you not weeping the tears about the people of Gaza? Who also, if you go to public opinion, the people of Gaza do not, it seems, in their majority, really assertively support Hamas, right? So people are being punished for the actions of an authority over them, with which on other grounds, for example, it's on economic grounds and welfare grounds, they have been critical of. All of this said, and recognizing that there's only 5 minutes to kick this off, the second thing I want to say is that there are a lot of layers to this question. So first of all, there's the layer which you could think about in terms of Israel-Palestine. You think about violence, think about occupation, think about land, think about the settlements. in the West Bank. Think about the way in which Gaza and Gazans are penned into this small area. And so the issues as between, if you like, Israel and Palestine, or Israel and Palestinians. Then there's a second layer of issues. Why do we all in the rest of the world get so concerned about this? Obviously, concern about suffering and war and so on is a good thing, but there's many wars that go on which actually produce more violence, and some of them that produce atrocities really on a level with what we see in Hamas in Israel, or the bombing by Israel in Gaza, produce suffering which is just as bad, and yet we pay very little attention to it. And I think that one of the reasons for that is a very human reason, that this part of the world that we're talking about plays a central role in the sacred geography, for want of a better term, of three major religions. This is an area which is of profound importance in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism as well. And even those of us who are very secular in our approach to world politics, or indeed in our approach to our lives, are influenced by this, because these are the cultures within which we live. And so there's a depth of feeling that this conflict arouses in observers that, for example, war in Sierra Leone never did, or war in Liberia never did. And then the third area, the third layering of this, of course, is geopolitics. And that's partly to do with the classics of strategy. Just simply the geographical position of the Middle East has always been strategically central in the rivalries of the great powers, and before that in the colonial history. There's also, of course, the question of oil, which made the Middle East region so fundamental to first Western European development, and then also Chinese. And that has made this whole area into an arena of geopolitical, geostrategic rivalry and confrontation, which again adds further layers of complexity and complication to what was already, if you just went peeled back down to sacred geography, or peeled back down below there to land and violence, it's already complicated enough. So I think it is not surprising that we find this to be a particularly intractable conflict. And as for thinking about, moving forward to possible solutions, possible outlines of different approaches, well, I'll come to that in further conversation. For the moment, what I would say simply is that when we're having this conversation, let's try not to fall into the trap of only talking about half the picture and allowing half the story to be what defines your position and your loyalties. We really need to think about the whole story and the whole picture if we're going to find a solution. Raditya, thank you so much for the opportunity to start this off, and I look forward to what my fellow panelists have to say.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I think Dan mentioned many important things, including the different opinion or position between the public and the government, this criticism of double standards, and these several layers of the conflict. But also, I think the last point is very important, not to fall to only see the half of the picture, but try to see the full picture. So before we move on for discussion, I will give the opening. I will give Margaret the opening remarks. Please, Margaret, it's yours. I think you're still on mute, Margaret. Yes.
I think that's right now. Well, thank you. And thank you, Dan. I really appreciate it and was nodding my head in great agreement with everything you were saying. The double standards in Australia have been quite breathtaking. And for me personally, very, very, very disappointing, because we, in the early within the early time of the after the first attack, we heard nothing about the other side. We only heard about the atrocity from one perspective, and now as other atrocities are continuing, we are still only saying that we're concerned about the initial atrocity. And the language is changing a little, but not sufficiently. And many Australians are devastated. We like to think, a very successful multicultural community. And so this double standard of only feeling sympathy for one group in this terrible situation is very disturbing for many Australians. But there are some things that we would like to think are possible. And after the way in which Australia voted, we have tried to change the language through working with those parliamentarians who are prepared to speak up for both sides in this debate. Of course, Australia, sadly, has a considerable war history for a middle power country. We are also a colonized country, first by the British Empire, and sometimes we feel by the United States. Since 1945, we have followed America into Korea, Vietnam, twice into the Middle East, including Afghanistan, and of course, more recently, Ukraine. Many of us, and particularly Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, question this, particularly as Australia itself is a former colony. We dispossessed, or the British dispossessed, the original First Nations of Australia, the Australian Aborigines, and we feel we should be in a better position to understand the situation in the Middle East and the situation of the Palestinian people, who also have been dispossessed of their land. We are particularly nervous as civil society. I'm glad that Dan made the point about the difference often between governments and the general public, because it's certainly true, and I've been in government, so I've been part of that debate. And you sit around a cabinet table or a meeting of ministers, and you hear very different language to the language you would hear out in the community. There's so much tension between nations, and so nations compromise. And I think in the situation that is facing the people of Gaza and Israel, there isn't a compromise. There isn't a compromise. There's only peace or war. And it's very hard to get the mainly male decision makers to go along with that particular philosophy, because war is seen as masculine and solving the problem. If you are thwarted, you get tough, you answer back, and you deal with the problem. But it's the women and children, the civilian populations, that so often suffer. So we in Australia, especially women and peace-loving men, we are constantly trying to find new ways to get greater conflict resolution, greater peace building. And Australia, I've talked about its war history, but we have a very proud peacekeeping history as well. And since the United Nations was formed, and we were central at the early discussions of the formation of the United Nations, but since that time, we have been involved in 37 peacekeeping operations, which for a middle power is, I think you'll agree, quite impressive. I'm looking forward to further discussion about how middle powers like ourselves can contribute. I know that it's going to be very important that countries in our region, particularly, you know, Indonesia, Malaysia, a number of other countries in our immediate Southeast Asian region, do try to work with our government to change their position and to make them much stronger in speaking up for international law and for peacekeeping. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And I think it's a very interesting point that you made, especially about middle powers. Your last point about Australia as middle powers and how it is very important to have this kind of middle power coalition, probably. It's between Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, and then maybe offering something, maybe not solution, but at least a discussion to find a way out of this. You also mentioned this interesting position, Australia as a former colony, but also Australia's own history of war. And I think one point that you made is that the civilians, women and children are suffering, especially suffering in this kind of situation, whereas the decision makers, which are mostly males, decides to keep this uncompromised position only between peace and war. And building on that, I will move to Irene to see whether Indonesia has its own position here, another middle power with a very different background compared to Australia. And maybe you can also touch upon your latest article on international order. So I'll give you also 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Mbak Irene,
Okay.
please.
Okay. Thank you, Radit, my colleague from our Jakarta International Relations students and also enthusiasts. First, I would like to thank Papa Gino Patijala and Dan Smith, also Margaret. I really appreciate that you are able to join us this evening, because I don't think we can leave Australia from the global North and South dialogue. Australia is very important to Indonesia. And, you know, I just graduated from an Australian university for my PhD in Monash University. So that makes this invitation very more important. I also alumni from Uppsala University in Sweden under Svensk. Just to highlight how important is the global North and South dialogue, because like Radit, I also have keen interest in how this potential dialogue taking place. I think Dan earlier mentioned about how we need to be humble with our history with regard to world conflict. And I think Indonesia is in the right position to realize that in the past we had problems in regard to East Timor issue, and currently we still have a tumultuous province in Papua and West Papua that sometimes ignited international concern. However, I probably need to have a bit difference in seeing how this entanglement fit into the discussion on the future projection of the global North-South regarding Palestine. One thing that I won't be, sugarcoating in terms of understanding the Palestinian-Israel problem is the way I understand this issue is at the core of the problem, there is a problem of the occupation. There's a problem of coloniality that gains support from several countries at the global north. That we think, when we started to write the article, the discussion was quite intense between me and my other two colleagues. We had the same perspective in discussing that how would we continue with discussing liberal order, that the basic derived from the human rights norm, understanding gender equality, understanding the right-based concern, and so on and so forth. Indonesia, as part of in 1955, we included in the anti-bloc or non-bloc alliance, right? The Palestine and several other West African countries supported our independence. But also Australia supported our independence when the revolutionaries tried to take control in 1948. So we had this discussion. Historically, I think we are in the right position to condemn what happened there. But at the same time, we also aware on what Hamas did that provoked or ignited the prolonged conflict. So we did not gloss the problem. However, in order to achieve less than perpetual peace, at least the condition where any parties could join the discussion table, there need to be several ways, which I think, I agree with Margaret, as a middle power, we are in the position to do so. For instance, in our article, we mentioned about increasing dialogue between like-minded states, included in ASEAN. We recognize, therefore, that Hamas also actually did not care about who became collateral during the first 7 October action, because they also hurted non-Israelis, non-combatants, the workers. And I think we also understand how, to some extent, Israel, with support of several countries in the Gulf War, had neglected the international humanitarian law. You know, they are protecting themselves under the phrases rights of self-defense. But I believe even in the studies of war studies and the security concerned, the right of self-defense has some limitations. So that begs questions on whether countries outside of these two belligerents, but also in ASEAN or several other regional entities, could take up this issue. To what extent international humanitarian law could apply to this complex, the level of complexity? Because it doesn't seem that they will, you know, back down from any pressures. But I believe even the strongest actor in this situation will hear a voice from its closest ally, for instance, the United States, or any countries that voted against the humanitarian truce or simply abstained, like Australia. And I think that Penny Wong mentioned in her Twitter that she discussed things with Minister Retno is a good start, is a good sign. So I think as middle power, we need to still find some possible maneuvers in order to always, you know, telling other parties, you know, let's find another solution, because 9,000 civilians died is not good at all for a potential of peace. So perhaps middle power actors can amplify their voice in order to, you know, for the international organization, the proponent of liberal order, pay attention to this and taking it up as a policy or global policy action. I hope I'm clear in this matter. Thank you, Reddit.
Thank you, Marina. I think it highlights several points that has been discussed many times in Indonesia, especially maybe in Indonesia and also other global South countries. This root of the conflict, and I will return back to Dan for that. So this issue of colonialism, of occupation, and this kind of perception in the South, in Indonesia, that the North, or many North countries, or let's say these countries in the North, have very different perspective on this. That's what a discussion in many countries in global South has been before. But I think it's also important that Irene also highlights that this is Indonesia has its own problems. So it might inform how the government views this, which also reflect back to what Dan mentioned in the beginning, the different position between the government and the people. And I think Irene also mentioned this, very similar to what Margaret mentioned, this kind of coalition of middle powers to put pressures into a greater powers like the US, for example, to then put pressures on Israel, I think, in this case. But I will go back to Dan. So I think one of the differences between the North and the South, I think Irene mentioned this discussion about colonialism and occupation. Do you share that thoughts, or that there are differences between how global South countries, former colonies, sees these issues, and whether other countries, more developed countries in the North, in Europe, sees this one. Do you agree with that, or do you have some more explanation on how or why this difference is, especially when you consider the UNGA resolution, you can see the difference. Do you agree with that, or do you have some thoughts, Krista?
No, I think the difference is absolutely glaring, and it's not surprising. I think that even those people in, let's say, Europe and North America, Japan as well, who are sensitive towards the fact that, after all, colonialism is a big part of these countries' history, don't really understand how deep that goes. One could say, for example, that the Middle East and North Africa's main experience of imperial domination was actually from the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't from the Europeans. So the Europeans started coming in quite late in the game, about sort of 1830s, going into Algeria, for example. And then the British and the French were coming along and grabbing bits here and there, and the Suez Canal became, this important strategic gateway to the eastern half of the British and other European empires. So, in one sense, in historical perspective, the Middle East's experience of European colonialism is relatively short. If you just look at the dates when colonial authority was established and when effective or actual independence was agreed, 80, 90 years, right? And since then, 50, 60, 70 years, depending on the exact date of independence. But that fact of European colonialism and domination remains huge, in part then because of what we don't often talk, because we don't like to use the leftist language, but it's an essential part of understanding world politics today, is neo-colonialism, is the power that was left to the former colonial empires after formal independence was granted. Their economic domination, their strategic leadership and domination, indeed their cultural influence is enormous. And if you go back, let's say you look to Latin America, where after all their independence was being achieved in the first phase some 200 years ago, but still the fact of having been former colonies is enormously powerful. And this is one part of the kind of, I don't know, the decontextualized, maybe blindness is too crude a word to use. It's the blinkers of decontextualization, if that doesn't sound too ridiculous, right? Is that you see just a narrow part of the story and you don't see the whole. So to understand Israel and Palestine, there are many things you need to bring into that picture, including the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, but also in areas of the Middle East, the pogroms which there were in Europe, the discrimination that there was through much of the Middle East. You need to understand that as part of the picture. But you also need to understand, I mean, Europe kind of shrugging off the problem of Judaism, of the Jewish population, saying, here, you have the problem, right? To an area which, at that point, Europe was in control of. And it's out of that the state of Israel gets created and formally recognized in the 1940s. For many people in Europe, this was about justice. For many people moving to Israel, this was about freedom. That's exactly a way in which you see only half the story, because for those people who were already there in Palestine, and then their descendants, their children and their grandchildren, this is an enormous injustice that has been imposed upon them. So if we're going to talk our way towards some kind of a solution, we've got to see these different perspectives. And I think that part of it is that the European leaders and also North American leaders have to kind of, confront colonialism a little bit head on with some humility. Maybe I say this a bit more easy. I'll tell you, I'm a colonial child. I was born in Sri Lanka. And when I've met Sri Lankan politicians and they've asked me, well, what was your family doing there? And I've said, well, there were two choices, weren't there? We could have been repressing you or could have been exploiting you. My father was actually part of the commercial class, so we were exploiting you. My first birthday was in Sri Lanka. My second birthday was in Kenya. My older brother and sister had their earlier birthdays in China and so on because of being there. And so I feel that that colonial history is very much a part of me. So if I'm going to be talking about peace in the world today, I have to have my eyes open to the colonialism in my cultural DNA, right? Or I'm just going to be speaking blindly the whole time, as this term which I've just invented for your benefit, the blinkers of decontextualization. I think that is what we are in Europe. We should put a lot of energy into trying to get away from
that. Thank you so much, Dan. I think that's illuminating in many levels. But I would move to Margaret. If you have like some comments, I saw you nodded when Dan explained his thinking. So maybe you have some comments on that, and also you mentioned Australia's history as well. So I think Pak Dino asked you just before we started whether Australia think it's part of the North, part of the South, and whether this colonial history, you mentioned it's important, and whether this can actually be the ground for Australia being the bridge between Europeans and maybe other countries in the global South. What do you think about that, Margaret?
Well, I'd like longer to think about it. Look, it's, I guess most countries are full of contradictions because, they've evolved over many different generations and different approaches to living. But Australia is a country of contradictions because on one hand, we're seen as brash and confident and a bit cheeky, and we don't take direction very easily. But on the other hand, we've inherited so much from a European, well, certainly a British culture, and of course the overwhelming influence of a modern American culture. And many of these inheritances are welcome and enjoyed by many Australians. But I think increasingly, it's not generally known that 50% of Australians have at least one parent born overseas. That's and a third of our population were themselves first generation born overseas. So to talk about Australia as European or British or American even, and of course that's different again, is quite false. And I think this is why when Australia is outside the overwhelming majority of the global community, particularly as we have played, I think, a pretty, and I don't think this is just a nationalistic view, Australia has treated the United Nations as a very important central feature for peace and human rights and good standards of behaviour around the world. And so when Australia equivocates, and that's what it does too often with difficult votes in the General Assembly, it really doesn't stand for anything. It just almost is looking over its shoulder. What do we do here? We've got to try to keep this one and this one and this one on side. So we'll just abstain. It's a cop-out, I would say. I mean, it is very interesting to look at the countries that voted against this ceasefire humanitarian resolution at the General Assembly. I estimated it, and don't take my maths too seriously because I'm not a mathematician, but it's a very small percentage of the global population. So while it's important for us to consider the implications of the North-South, I think it's also important for us to recognise that only about 5%, 13 countries, and about 5% of humanity was opposed to this basic humanitarian resolution. And I think that's something that the global community, whether we voted for, against, or abstained, we should see that as very significant in this day and age, that overwhelming vote was for humanity, for finding a solution. And I think that's where the middle powers, I mean, let's face it, the major powers aren't doing a very good job and haven't been. Now, you'd expect someone from a middle power country like Australia to say that. But I mean, the Security Council is predominantly major powers, or at one stage they were major powers in the case of Britain and France. And you would like to think that because of their significance and their strength and their leadership, that they'd be better at setting an example. But of course, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen if the debate is going this way, a particular grouping veto. If the debate is going in another direction, it's the veto again. So we can't rely on the Security Council. And that's a very sad statement, I know, but we can't. And that makes the middle power solution much more possible if middle powers are prepared to take on that responsibility. And I think the vote, both the yes, the supportive vote, and indeed the abstaining vote, gives us some confidence that middle powers want to find solutions in the absence of the Security Council being able to find solutions.
Thank you, Margaret. I think that leads us to. I'll give the chance for Irene to also comment, but also this discussion whether there is already a consensus within the people. It doesn't matter whether you're a north-south, as Margaret mentioned. It's only 5% of the global population that actually against the resolution. So do you think there is this already a cooperation between the north and south in terms of population, or do you still think, as I think many on YouTube are already prepared to ask questions here, do you also think that there is still a differences and there is still a need to have deeper discussion on this issue between the north and south? Irene, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Radit. And also, I really enjoy what Dan and Margaret mentioned earlier, the contextualization, decontextualization, and perception about self-perception of colonialism and how we should, try to entangle this aspect when we want to be at the present, understanding the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Continuing what Margaret mentioned earlier about the result of the UNGA vote last week, I agree that with 120 votes, I think we can still optimistic. We can still have this optimism. No matter we see or read everyday headlines, continuing passive, offensive, increasing number of victims, right? And in a way, still, creating some skepticism, even to my own field of academy, international relations, especially constructivism. It created questions, where does the constructivism go from here? Because, in the end, it's already statements everywhere, even from the strongest. And I really appreciated the gesture from the Jewish community in the US and in several places in Europe, in France, in Germany. Regardless, the government banned demonstration. And just recently, I read an article in, I think, in The Economist, that students are not supposed to mention their perspective in terms of Middle East conflict, which is completely hilarious. And I think exactly because of that, I still think there still need to be a dialogue, a continuous dialogue, because that is the last resort we can have as a civilized individuals in civilized countries. How else we will maintain our position for our children, grandchildren, and the next generation that, hey, one time before, I just stay silent and do nothing with the Middle East violence. Regardless, I still do nothing in the violence in Myanmar or in Sudan or in Ukraine and so on and so forth. So these wars and victims, they're just not numbers. This is, I think, the point of departure why we still need to have dialogue. In regard to the differences between understanding of the coloniality context implications, for instance, me as probably since 1945, in the Indonesian independence, and since I was born decades later, story about how we were colonized 350 under the Dutch, 3.5 years under the Japanese occupation, and then transition of power between the Allied forces, right, to Indonesian sovereignty, problem in East Timor, problem in East Papua. I think as part of the international relation community, I wanted to position myself that I am aware of the global structure that shaped Indonesia's decision in taking East Timor and in taking Papua. For instance, that is one conscious position how I understand the implication of coloniality. Not that I am unaware of the colonial mindset among non-Western community, because that also happened. But with regard to the topic that we discussed today, that could shape also our attitude in understanding how we should proceed in discussing the future of Israel-Palestinian conflict. I think I also have a bit of critical review with regard to counterterrorism effort. I really understand the history of counterterrorism, global counterterrorism, and that recently there is a bit of unison among European and the US, maybe counterterrorism experts to corner Hamas. You know, of course, what they did is wrong, but to put them and label them as terrorists. One thing that I understand, learning from the study of insurgencies, revolutionaries, they came from a specific reason. So labeling them terrorists and maintaining the way, chasing them without, considering the collateral damage will also impede any discussion toward probably mediation or more sensible approaches to reduce potential conflicts or victims. I hope I make sense in my response to you, Radit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mbak Irin. I think I still have a lot of questions, but there are also questions from our audience in YouTube, and I will choose some of them. Which I think one is based on what Dan said before, but all other, so Margaret and Irina can also jump in. So the question from Sakib from Indonesia is that there are a lot of people who say that this is not about religion. Religion is just covers. This is about natural resources, especially oil, as Dan mentioned before. So do you really think that this is not about religion, that this is about natural resources, and religion is just being used to fuel emotions? Because that, I think, will then influence our way of thinking, our way out of this conflict. So maybe I will start from Margaret first, because I usually start from Dan. So I'll start from Margaret.
Yeah.
and then I'll move to Irene, and then I'll let Dan also comment on that, this issue of religion and whether this is about religion or not.
Yeah. Look, I think it's there are many contributing factors, and yes, religion, history, the fact that the global community has had, well, certainly since the end of World War II, with the formation of the United Nations, the world community has, and the Security Council has had the opportunity to try to resolve, work through, find new ways of working on a peaceful outcome, and we've failed. And I mean, that's on all of us. We've failed, and we can't now sit back and play the blame game, because yes, the blame rests in terms of actual collective punishment, if you like. You can point the finger here or there, but we have to point the finger to ourselves as the global community, that we have failed. We have, there's been so much talk and efforts for the two-state solution, but not enough actual commitment. And that's where we need, as middle powers, to say, look, we can't continue just blaming one side or another. There are reasons, historic, economic, religious. There are reasons why these terrible conflicts occur, and it's no use just sitting on the sidelines blaming, or indeed fighting militarily. You've got to sit down and talk global conversations, mediation, international community leaders, and working through middle powers.
Yes, but Irina, you have a comment on that? On the issue of religion, and also whether this is about religion, or as Margaret mentioned, this is part of a lot of contributing factors into this.
Yeah.
Do you still think that? Yeah.
Yes. I have two answers. I must say that I discussed it heavily with my husband. He's a Nahdlatul Ulama activist, and I also raised in that situation. So perception that this conflict is about religion is pretty much obvious. And as an Indonesian, where majority of us are Muslims, I don't deny that as part of the reality that should be taken in our conversation. That is why I think our foreign minister approaches very diligently. She is able to convey the message that this is not only about religion, although this I appreciate, and understanding about why there is a perception about this. Because we also understand that, for instance, taking it into as an example, people who were kidnapped, people who were killed by the Israel's attack, they're not only Muslims, but also some Christian Palestinians. See, that is how we try to discuss about this issue. Of course, in terms of theological discussion, the importance, meaning of Al-Aqsa Mosque, of the intersection between Muslim and Christian and Jewish places of worship, all destroyed, right? From the perspective of people who are really identify themselves with their religion, it is very sad. And I think this is also can be part of the dialogue, because if not, then what is the use? Because I think this is the toughest case in terms of having dialogue, is to recognize the identity or give respect to some extent to the identity of the person who wanted to be in a dialogue, or even just to express their, grievances or happiness or whatever under the guise of their religion or identity. Of course, it is not about a conflict of religion per se, but religion is part of it. That is, I think, my point.
Thank you, Marina. I'll go back to Dan because Dan, I think, highlighted at the beginning the need to see the full picture. So, Dan, please, could you comment on that question from
Yeah,
YouTube?
I mean, I've studied armed conflicts and wars of many different kinds for a long period of time, and I have yet to find an armed conflict which has a single cause.
Yes.
So saying it's about religion is saying part of the story. Saying it's about geopolitical interest is part of the story. Saying it's about the rights of Palestinians is part of the story. Saying it's about how prevalent anti-Semitism was in the pre-modern and early modern world is part of the story. So yes, it is in part about religion. It is in part about resources. It's how do you approach this then? I think, I mean, my first suggestion would be that if you try to resolve it as a religious conflict and then say, well, that's part of the story, so now let's try to resolve it as a resource conflict. I don't think you manage to do that. I don't think you manage to go anywhere. I think you just get trapped into a number of different compartments.
Mhm.
The thing that unites is that these are people. And these are people with rights, and rights have actually been agreed at an international level in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was agreed that people had the right to be freed of colonial domination and so on. So it's been difficult because states are human institutions and humans are flawed. It has been difficult for even the best who most wanted to live up to those ideals really to live up to them. And so part of the humility that we need to have as we approach this is a kind of a recognition that even with the best of intentions, you can not get to the right point. But you kind of need to start out with the best of intentions. There might not be forgiveness for starting out with not the best intentions. So I think, yes, I think this is very, very complex. As I said, it's a conflict and a set of issues with a lot of layering of different factors in. But the part that unites it is to start from a stand of human rights. And one of the rights that people have is to be citizens of a state that reflects their needs and that reflects their, you know, their aspirations, is congruent with their identity, and gives them a voice about issues of their interest. And that's how, whatever the name of the framework is that is given to that, that is where we need to be going with this.
Thank you so much, Dan. Yeah, I think that's a very important point. All three of you made that this is complex, and it couldn't be just one factor, right? You have to consider all the other factors before even trying to have some kind of solution, because one factors delving deep into that will not really solve the other part of the problem. It could become a trap. There is another question which I like very much, because this has been discussed over and over again for the last year, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, from Cynthia. So the question is, can we actually expect the West to change its gesture to treat Israel-Palestine war and Ukraine war in a fair manner? So in a similar manner, I think there are a lot of in the global South criticize the West and the North for their position, their difference in position, but also you can see it from the other way. There are also people from the North that criticize the global South for, you didn't say anything about Ukraine. So how can we actually deal with this? Can we change this? What other discussion that should be made here? I think Dan mentioned at the beginning this kind of hypocrisy or double standards.
Yes.
And double standard happens in both directions, not only in the West but also in the South, I would say. So if you look at that situation, do you have any thoughts? I'll go to Irene first, and then I'll move to Dan and then Margaret.
Yeah, I agree with what I did, and also Dan mentioned earlier about ambiguity or hypocrisy, to say it better. To put it better, I think that also departed from the consciousness about history of both regions, right? Europe and the Middle East, but also the sentiments, the proximity of or self-identification that who are in conflict, who are they? But I think another factor with regard to Ukrainian issues specifically is how it's shaped. It is shaped in the specific countries or continent, or in terms of the geopolitical setting, like in Southeast Asia, for instance. But also it is added again with another factor, the perception toward actors who are in the middle of the war. There is this perceptions, for instance, as part of the international relation community students, I always amazed on how it is like for the US to be able to always put themselves at the front, if not in the middle or in the back of any global conflict. You know, but that doesn't left Russia for what happened with regard to Ukraine and its position as part of the P5 in the UNSC. And in that situation, I saw what Indonesia strived to do as part of the middle power country is try to have its message delivered temporary chief of P5, right? We try to have a subtle diplomacy among countries in terms of the Ukrainian diplomacy effort, send help as well. But also at the current conflict, Indonesia as part of the middle power, try to have a negotiation lobby and so on and so forth, even until ASEAN and as part of ASEAN GCC and as part of the organisasi OKI. So in Indonesia, I can say the dissonance between what the population said about Middle East, for instance, is less. We have less gap with what the government did. But in terms of Ukraine, I can see this a bit different. There is a big gap, a bit of gap. A particular support of Ukrainian people access, but also somewhat support more to Russia, for instance, in terms of sovereignty aspect. So that is how I understand, or trying my best to explain what it is, because that also reflects Indonesian position, right? We see problem separation in Papua as an uneven development programs, right? For particular sectors in the community and the government, definitely, there is no question about having an independent state. And we expect diplomatically our allies at the north and at the south support this position, state position. But to do so, we try to have Papua as developed as possible as other provinces. This is how I understand the insights that perhaps support the Russia's position in Ukraine, which is believed by by some communities in Indonesia. Although there are, of course, contested perspectives. No, there should be not that way. We cannot close the grievances of the people. There should be dialogue, there should be a referendum, and so on. I think I need to ask Radit if my explanation is clear.
Really, yeah. Yes, I think it's clear, Irene. And I'll then move to Dan first before Margaret, especially regarding whether Irene mentioned about Indonesia's position, maybe many in the global south, how they actually view these two different conflicts. I wonder whether Dan also sees in a similar way, whether the West, or not the West in this case, the North, can actually change its position to address this criticism by, you also mentioned at the beginning, this double standards and hypocrisy. What can the West do, basically?
Yeah, I mean, this gets us into very complicated waters. Let me just try to look at this more as a kind of an analytical question than as a normative question where I'd be advocating one position or another. It seems to me that if you look at both the Russia's re-invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February last year and the particular Hamas incursion into Israel on the 7th of October this year, and you look at what happens to the policy of a group of states that we sometimes call the global north and we sometimes call the west, and we're not quite sure what to name them, but we know who we're talking about. Part of what happens is that policy becomes less nuanced, a little bit less dispassionate, and rather more committed. And so I would say, for example, that I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, beginning in 2014, is completely illegal. I do not agree with the idea that it is okay to try to change international borders by force. I agree that it's okay to try and change them by discussion, persuasion, agreement. I'm sure that in discussion, persuasion, and agreement, influence, some of which is not entirely to be welcomed because it's a bit of the big power against the small power. I'm sure that will happen, but don't use force. To me, that's the red line, right? But in the 8 years between Ukraine being taken over and the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine, that policy of the West, the North, was actually quite nuanced. It was trying not to go too far. It was trying to keep things under control, keep it relatively quiet. Could you get a negotiated agreement out of it? Could there be something that the two sides could accept? As soon as the much greater violence of the reinvasion occurred, all of those questions went out the window. The question is simply support Ukraine, yes or no?
Yeah.
Right? Over Israel and Palestine, I think one has seen over the years a good deal of impatience with Israel about the settlements, about the occupation, about rejecting the two-state solution, which everybody else has seemed to think would be the desirable outcome, and which at one point, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, had overwhelming support amongst both the Israeli and the Palestinian population, if opinion polls are to be agreed. But come that violence on the 7th of October, and all of that nuance and, looking at it from different angles goes out the window. So I think one of the problems that we're talking about here is the impact of violence on political positions, and especially reservations and nuance. There's a kind of feeling in the West that, when push comes to shove, you got to say which side you're on. That's not always helpful in resolving the conflict, but you can understand it because a lot of people, I think, when push comes to shove, you feel you need to declare your loyalties. So that's a long way of not answering the question. The short way of answering the question would be to say that I'm sure that there can be much more nuance and subtlety and acceptance of the full picture in Western policy. I don't think we will ever get towards, at least in my lifetime, towards the kind of perfection of that perception. But I think we can expect that the double standards become rather less glaring, that the hypocrisy becomes rather less extreme, but that process can be stopped, can be interrupted at different times by the explosion of radical violence. And I think that some of those who inflict that extreme violence actually know precisely what they're doing to the Western mentality, because you have seen that before. What happened with 9/11, for example? Suddenly the world became divided into two blocks, and boom, America's under attack. We know how that worked, and produced a war on terror, which, as a former foreign minister of Australia, Gareth Evans, once said, has only succeeded in producing more war and more terror. It was a completely misguided response.
Yes.
But that's the kind of, that's the way our political culture takes us. I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'll move to Margaret.
Yes.
Do you have any comment on that? Yes.
Look, I think it is so complex, and can't claim to have any answers. I can make just a couple of observations. I think that the Western media, and we haven't mentioned the media tonight, the Western media has a great deal to answer for. I mean, we talk about governments, we talk about civil society, we talk about the terrorists or military, whoever we want to place some blame on. But really, if we could get a better informed and nuanced Western media, I mean, every war, every conflict is interpreted to the rest of the community, the world, by largely Western media. And some of it is absolutely disgraceful, either in its ignorance or its deliberate bias, and you come back, to the double standards. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd say, as you'd expect me to say, is it is long overdue that the global community took more notice of 50% of its population. I mean, we constantly look to world leaders. They're still overwhelmingly male. And like the Security Council, at the moment, in terms of this current dispute, they're not doing much. They're not solving their own problem. Neither, Hamas is not. Neither is Netanyahu. So I do think that in anything that comes out of this particular dialogue, there should be recognition that until we insist that women, peace and security, which has been agreed at the General Assembly, that there was a resolution that more women should be involved in conflict resolution, we're going to find that women and children as civilians are the prime sufferers, because women are not at the peace table. Some years ago, when the first Gulf War was underway, a group of women at the United Nations went to see Kofi Annan and said, why don't you send in a group of women from the region, not from the north or the south, but from the region. Send in a delegation of women peacekeepers to try to resolve, or peacemakers, not peacekeepers. And he said, well, I'll talk to a few people and see if it's possible. It obviously wasn't possible. And then subsequently, of course, the Iraq War followed. But we've got to do something, because what has been practiced since 1945 is not working.
Thank you so much, Margaret. So we're running out of time, but I would just ask one last question, and I hope you can just give short answer for each of you, because this is organized by FPCI Middle Power Studies Network. So I have to ask, if I think Margaret already mentioned it several times, whether middle powers like Indonesia, like Australia, others like Turkey, I don't know, Mexico, South Korea, probably Sweden, all others, European middle powers as well, can they actually do something? Can they work together and then offer something that is very different to what the current situation now? So I'll start from Dan, Margaret, and then Irene will close. And just a brief, also closing remarks from you. So Dan, please.
Yeah, I think that when you have the three great powers at loggerheads, and when you have when Trump was president, and if he or a Trumpist candidate comes back in the next presidential election, you would have three great powers, none of whom believe in the international order as it stands, all of whom believe that they're losing out with it. And there are many things which are wrong with the international order, but I think that kind of throwing all the cards up in the air would be a dangerous and a risky thing to do. So in those circumstances, the first question is do you need somebody else to step forward? Do you need others to come up to the plate? And the answer, I think, is clearly yes. And then obviously the candidates for doing that are the middle powers, although I wouldn't leave it at just the middle powers, because some of the smaller powers, I mean, some even within the UN context, the small island developing states, for example, which are really small, you know, in fact, you wouldn't want to use the word power to them at all until 15 of them get together. And now they've got a voice and they've got a little bit of weight in the UN, which they can use. So I think it is essential that happens. And I think the difficulty is that all the time there are pressures. I mean, you mentioned some of them, you mentioned Sweden and so on. And Sweden, you would have thought a couple of years ago would, of course, be an ideal candidate to be in that sort of role. And now a question mark must be placed over that because of the entry into NATO. However, you would also perhaps think of countries like Norway, which is a NATO member, also being one of those middle powers. So I'm not putting the question mark over Sweden in order to say that the answer is no, it can no longer play that role. But it would be slightly different and perhaps even more fruitful. So I think that a coming together of a kind of a middle power network at intergovernmental level could turn out to be an extremely useful thing. And you do see versions of that already in the UN. They're called friends of. So friends of an issue or friends of a conflict, friends of a problem, a group of middle powers that brings themselves together diplomatically to work out common positions and to discuss. And I think, so in short, my answer to your question is yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Margaret, please.
Yes, I'll be very brief. I think definitely. I attended the non-aligned summit many years ago, and I was extremely impressed, having been at more traditional for Australia, more traditional forums. I was very impressed with some of the language and the idealism of the non-aligned summit in those days. And of course, today it's moving or some of those countries are moving in a different direction. But I think that when it comes to the situation that we see nightly on our news, something has to be done, and it has to be done quickly. It has to be done in a way where people of goodwill who are not trying to propose from one perspective or another, but only for the good of humanity.
Thank you, Margaret. And I'll give the last but not least thought to Irene. Please, just a short, brief remark.
Yes, just short. I think, well, in 2017, I read an article about Indonesia, Malaysia, the middle power statecraft in terms of multipolarity. So I think that is still relevant for today's Middle East situation. And we need to, of course, consider every statement and also proposal from these countries, of course, to take it up on board and try to find like what is the threat among proposal with regard to peace and roles of middle power countries in the sense of lobby, partnering or giving advice to the allies from the belligerents and so on and so forth, but not stopping dialogue, definitely.
Thank you so much, Marian. I think I thank all the speakers. I don't really want to, have to conclude or make a general conclusion, but I think it is important to have another dialogue. Not only North-South dialogue, as Dan mentioned, even the term North-South might be very problematic. But I think it is important to have another dialogue, maybe middle power countries together to have a dialogue, not only on these issues, but any other issues, especially during this great power conflict. And I would I would like to thank Dan Smith, Margaret Reynolds, Irina Gayatri. I know it's late especially in Hobart. So I will give the floor back to our MC, Herza. And again, thank you so much for all three of you, three distinguished speakers, for sharing your thoughts. I'll give it back to the MC, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Adityo, and all of our speakers for the insightful conversation. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, today's event has come to an end. We would like to once again thank Mr. Dan Smith, Director of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Mrs. Margaret Reynolds, President of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and former Senator of Queensland, Australia, and Ms. Irene Gayatri, Senior Researcher at National Research and Innovation Agency, for being the speaker on today's discussion. And also thank you, Mr. Adityo Dharmaputra, for being the moderator for today's discussion. We would like to also thank the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute for partnering with FPCI Middle Power Studies Network on today's virtual public discussion. This event is available to be rewatched at our YouTube channel, Secretariat FPCI. Once again, thank you for joining today's public discussion, and we'll see you in our next event.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
I'll see
Thank
you later.
Thank you so much,
Right, thank you, Dan,
Margaret and
Thank you.
Irene.
Good to
and
meet you.
Margaret, and Harsa.
Thanks a lot, everybody. It was a great
Yes.
conversation.
Dan.
Thanks.
Yes,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Yes.